Shalom, everyone. It's December the 20th, 2021. We are talking about Parshat Shmot. We are starting a brand new book of Shmot, this week. And we can't get over the fact that it's a very different focus, a very different set of themes, very different kind of piece of literature. The book of Breshit, as we all recall, was focused on our family foundational stories, the personalities of the patriarchs, the various adventures, challenges that they had, and what we did in a lot of our classes, we looked very carefully into their characters. We looked deeply into the stories and tried to really understand stories within the stories based on the clues that were given to us in the various verses that we chose. So we're going to keep that approach here with Shmot, notwithstanding the fact that already we see from the very beginning of the book of Shmot that the focus is changed. It's now on the people in Egypt, and emerging from the people is the character of Moses. Today, what I want to focus on is not the character of Moses, but I want to focus on some a few verses that get some attention. I think they get a little more attention these days, and we'll ask the question why that is, relating to the Hebrew Midwives. But before we get to that, I'd like to first do the text. We'll do the text in English, and then in Hebrew. We'll look at it very closely. It's chapter 1 in the book of Shmot, and I'm going to bring it up on the screen right now. I'm going to bring it up in English, and then we'll do it in Hebrew. Okay, here we go. So the book starts Ve'ela Shmot. These are the names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt, with Jacob coming with his household, each coming with his household. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, Issachar, Zvulun, and Benjamin. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased greatly, so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks, and with all sorts of tasks in the field. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and one Puah, saying, "When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth." And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." I want to say, having read this now in English, I want to just underscore how difficult it is to translate the text adequately, and how difficult it is to get the meaning of the text, or all the nuances, without the Hebrew. It's just impossible. There's so much going on a textual level in Hebrew that is lost to us in the translation. But regardless of that, I want to just point to and I have the Hebrew text here And I'm just going to make reference to a couple of things before we go into the focus, which will be on the mialdot, the Hebrew midwives. So the text, as we've said many times, really discloses a transition. It's really important to start the book of Shmot noting that there's a transition going on. Okay, all right. So Vela Shmot, these are the names, blah, 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 blah. And then we get the pre-transition, Vayamot Yosef, and I have to point out that Jonathan always corrects me when I say Vayamat. It's not Vayamat. It's always you always pronounce a kamatz katon, Vayamot. Vayamot Yosef v'chol echav. Ilana, right? Getting the nod. Vayamot Yosef v'chol echav. Joseph died, all his brothers, v'chol hadorahu. Okay, can I just say this with a little bit of emotion? I'm so sad about that. It's just, you know what? You have to remind us that they died. It's emotional for us to read that passage. We acknowledge that the entire generation is gone. And the truth is we could do a whole lesson on generational transition altogether, because at the moment that a generation is gone, it really signals something new. So that I would call that the pre-transitional verse in this chapter. And then the next note, Uvnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu bim'od me'od v'timaleh ha'aretz otam, which is a stunning verse. It's absolutely stunning. Of course, it's familiar to us because we quote this verse in the Haggadah of Passover. The children of Israel paru were fruitful. Vayishritzu. It's such a strange word. It's they swarmed, which and I'm going to say this in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, that the narrator here is telling us the way that the people are just reproducing themselves, but also giving us a hint that this is the way that they are being seen by the Egyptians. The Egyptians see them as just multiplying like swarms, right? And that is a destabilizing feature, right? When you see, people that are just increasing around you, okay? Vayirbu, they become multiplied. Vayirov means many. Vayatzmu, they get in certain strength. Bim'od ma'od, very, very much. Vatimaleh ha'aretz otam, the earth became filled with them. The whole country became filled with them. It's a stunning verse that tells you that they are prolific. And of course, the rabbis have such a gorgeous midrash on this. And the midrash says that, and we quoted at the Haggadah, that every time a woman gave birth, she gave birth to sextuplets. Okay, and it's a very strange midrash. Why would the rabbis create that kind of midrash? And I've asked this question many times, and it seems to me that the obvious answer is because once you get to the population census of the Israelites as they embark into the desert, you're in very, very high numbers according to the Torah. And in order to get to very, very high numbers, you need an exponential growth that is really a kind of factor of 6, right? So it's an exponential factor of many things, many more than one, right? And that it's more than the natural childbirth reproduction rate of, I don't know, 3, 4, or whatever. It's they're having many, many, many children over generations, so that in the space of the compressed time of the between the 70 people that are down there and the 2.5 million that come out a couple of hundred years later, that's one way to explain is that this is depending on how you understand the numbers altogether, which we've talked about. Okay, so now I said that verse 6, the death of that generation, the pre-transition. Then 7 is the kind of, and by the way, everybody multiplied. Then verse 8, this is the transitional verse. Vayakom, another kamatz katon, Vayakom melech hadash, a new king came up al Mitzrayim, on Egypt. Shelo yada et Yosef. Very, very enigmatic phrase, that didn't know Joseph. What does it mean he didn't know Joseph? And why didn't he know Joseph? And how didn't he know Joseph? So last year, I reviewed our last year's class. Last year, we looked at this very, very closely. We talked about the presentation of anti-Jewish policies, anti-Hebrew policies, stemming from this, and the cluster of interpretations that go from, he didn't recognize Joseph, or he enacted new policies against Joseph and the descendants. And I would say that if you read the last chapters of Genesis, Breshit, carefully, you see already that there's a beginning of animosity between the Egyptian people and Joseph, because what has Joseph done at the end of Breshit? Basically, he's enslaved the entire Egyptian population. They are hungry; they have no food. He's basically said, "Look, you can sell me all your property; I'll give you food." And then they have no more property, and they say, "Well, you can become enslaved, indentured servants to me," and that's what happens. And you can imagine that must have either infuriated the Egyptians, or at least made them a little bit, I don't know, vengeful, or created some kind of resentment. Um, so there's a new pharaoh. It may indicate maybe a new dynasty, or maybe indicates that the policies, as we looked at last year, they change based on the interests that are in, and the perceived interests that the king has at the time. And so, what is he saying? Vayomer el amo, hine am b'nei Yisrael rav v'atzum mimenu. Verse 9, he says to his people, this is the am, the people of Bnei Yisrael. And that's the first time that the word am, nation, is used with regard to the children of Israel. And that is the transition moment. So up until now, we have pre-transitions, but here, now that the people are referred to by an outside person as an am, they are a nation, rav v'atzum mimenu, they are great and they are mighty from us, hava nikamalo, and then he has the policies of the fear that they will become great. Haya ki tikrena milchama, if we become engaged in a war, this people will be a fifth column. V'nosaf gamhu al sonenu, they will add to our enemies. V'nocham banu, and they will have an insurrection against us from within, and we will be thrown out. So there's this sense of the fear of the other, and how the Israelites managed to be that, and why they stayed there. That's all good stuff for discussion, but it's not our discussion. Vayasimu alav sarei misim. I love to point out that there's a lot of assonance in this sentence. Vayasimu alav sarei misim leman anoto besiv lotam vayiven arei miskenot lefaro et pitom bet Ramses. So masa simu samo misim, that seems to be played on in this verse, and why that is, I don't know, but I hear it in my ear, okay? And so what is so interesting is that the more oppression that they experience, the more they become numerous. V'chasher yanu oto, the more they are oppressed, the more numerous they become. They spread out. Vayakutsu mipnei b'nei Yisrael. And this is also this word here, vayakutsu, that the people of Egypt were incensed because of that. So the policies that Pharaoh enacts have uniform adherence they are validated by the sense that already exists in the people, the xenophobic sense that they have. Okay? And they give them terrible labor. Verse 14, Vayimararu, they make them bitter. They mararu et chayehem, they bitter their lives with terrible labor. And worship and do it and oppress them bifarech. Okay, now we're going to go focus on our story, which is the Mialdot, and I'm going to skip through here to my text here. Okay. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim lamialdot ha'ivriot asher shem ha'achat Shifra v'shem ha'shenit Pua. I'm going to give an open translation of this. The king of Egypt said to the midwives, the Hebrews, okay, and I'm being deliberate here and not saying the Hebrew midwives, but I'm just going to translate those two words, the midwives, the Hebrews, and we're going to leave in a question here, are they the Hebrew midwives? Is Ivriot a modifier of Mialdot,
Yes.
midwives?
Yes.
Or does the term mean, are they the midwives to the Hebrews? Okay? And you'll see why this is a very, very important debate. It's a very important debate. I wouldn't have brought it to the class if it didn't have a very strong moral message to it. Okay? So, Asher Shema Achat Shifra v'Shema Shenit Pua. One is named Shifra, one is named Pua. What exactly that means, we don't know. But, the Bible scholars point out that these two names, Shifra and Pua, are Semitic names, that means they're not Egyptians. Now, I was looking, for any kind of contrary evidence. Anybody who thinks that Shifra and Pua are in fact Egyptian names, I got to call Gary Rensburg to ask him that question, or I'll write him a note later. Anyway, I'm bringing here a little paragraph from Herbert Rand. He was a member of our shul.
Oh, wow.
May his memory be a blessing. He wrote an article in 1970, which was published in the Israel Exploration Journal. And he often talked about it because he was very proud that Nahum Sarna quoted him and gave him a footnote in his commentary on the book of Genesis. So we remember Herbert Rand for a blessing, and I know I can just see he would be so delighted that I brought at least a paragraph. This is a longer article. He talks about a couple of vases in the Brooklyn Museum that have depictions of midwives. But the most important point that I wanted to share for the class right now is that, we have medicalized childbirth in the modern era, such that childbirth is, done in a hospital for the most part, and it's done by OBGYNs, people who are specialists, for the reason that, well, everything is medicalized in our time, and, because we know that lots of things can happen in childbirth, lots of complications, and the setting of the hospital has become, of course, the important setting, the most important setting in order to prevent any kinds of calamities, when we know that in pre-modern societies, birth was one of the most dangerous things, both for mothers and for children. Okay, so infant mortality was high, and maternal mortality was also high. So midwives, being a professional midwife, was something that you employed for the sake of birth, and they had specialties. So he writes in the first paragraphs of his article, there are many references to the practice of obstetrics by midwives in the Bible. No reference, however, is made to male physicians assisting at confinements. In ancient Egypt as well, assistance at childbirth and the practice of gynecology were not functions of the physician. It was the midwife who attended the delivery, cut the umbilical cord, and washed the newborn child. There were medical papyri, which contained the standard methods for determining the fact of pregnancy, for predicting the sex of the unborn, and whether the infant would live or die. Indeed, The Egyptian sage Pham may have been the source of such information in those treatises. This general practice of midwifery by Hebrew midwives in the ancient Egypt is attested by our passage. The reference therein to the Hebrew midwives, named Shifra and Pua, attempts one to suggest that the text may be referring to an obstetrical and gynecological team or a midwife's professional guild. So he says that Shifra Pua may have been the name of a guild. And the reason why he says this, I think it makes a little bit of sense, which is there are a lot of people. They would have been very busy. It's one thing if you're a moil, you have to go from bris to bris to bris. But if you're a midwife, so there had to be dozens of them because the rate of birth was very, very high. And so he makes the theory that Shifrapua is the name of a guild, and it's not corroborated. But what he goes into is he shows that the profession was so developed that there was a kind of a whole series of ceramics devoted to it that depict midwives and also were probably used. He theorizes that they function, believe it or not, as receptacles for a primitive kind of pregnancy test. He refers to vases that are found in the Brooklyn Museum. They're dated from around this time, the time of the patriarchal period, and they're open at the top and open at the bottom. And so what he theorizes is that they would take date pits and put them in the vase, and they would take the urine of pregnant or of women, and they would pour that on the date pits, and if the date pits would sprout, that was a positive. And if it didn't, it was a negative. Now you're laughing, and you should be laughing, but that's how you can find out pregnancy pretty much based on the similar substance today. It's a urine test basically, and what happens is the stick shows us a line. If you're pregnant, one line shows up, and if you're not pregnant, it's two lines if you're pregnant, one line if you're not. And I think what it tests is, and I wish Renee were here. I'll ask her tomorrow. It tests the presence of hormones in the urine, basically, or whatever chemical substances that the body throws up. And so it's very interesting that would be already some awareness of something in antiquity. So I cite that here both to honor Herbert Rand's memory and also to share something very, very interesting in the course of this, and to put the story in the context of a certain reality. This is a very important theme. Gary Rensburg talks about it in his lectures a lot, that a lot of the book of Exodus, you would be surprised, has actual Egyptian sources to it, or has actual Egyptian references. And this would be a good place to ask some questions about that for someone who specializes in Egyptology. Okay. Well, we go on. So, Vayomer, the Pharaoh says, the king says, and by the way, the king is not named here, but the midwives are. Okay, that ought to cue a reader that they are very special. Okay, whether or not they are Hebrew or, in fact, non-Hebrew or Egyptian. He says, Vayomer biyaledchen et ha'ivriot, when you birth the Hebrews. And here I'm going to say, this is interesting. Why would he be directing Hebrew midwives to birth, when you birth the Hebrews? It doesn't, he could have said, when you birth your own. But so I'm saying that this might be a piece of evidence that they're not Hebrews. Uritem ala avnaim, and when you see on the footstool, the birthing stool, whatever that is, im benhu, if it's a boy, vamiten oto, you kill him. Mimbati v'chaya. So he says, if it's a boy, put him to death. If it's a girl, you keep you keep the child alive. Why would you do that? Very simply, you eliminate the threat by a growing male population, and you deploy the captive female population, basically to farm out more production of Egyptians. Okay, this is just a very, very cruel, genocidal decree. So, in issuing the decree to the midwives, the king obviously relied upon the ease with which the baby could be killed at the moment of delivery by means not easily detectable in those days. That's Nachum Sarna's comment on this, and he's basically saying, look, what could she have done? What could the midwife have done? By very small effort, a midwife could really render the child dead. It wouldn't take very much to do that, and he's relying on that, on their collaboration to pursue basically a policy of genocide, okay, against the male children. What does the text say then to us? Vatir'enna hamildot et ha'elokim v'lo asu. The midwives feared God. So again, I would say that this is another hint of evidence that they are not Hebrews, right? First of all, it doesn't make sense for the women, if they're midwives and they're Hebrews, to kill their own. They would not do that. But the fact that I would say this supports the idea that they are not Hebrew and that they feared God, and they didn't do that. Kasher diber aleim melech Mitzrayim, as the king had told them, vatechayena et hayeladim, they kept the boys alive. So in the Bible, the demand of fear of God is a demand made on every person created in God's image, his image. A Gentile devoid of the fear of God is branded by the Bible as a traitor to his elementary obligations as a human being. And this is from Nechama Leibowitz, and she points out in her chapter on this text that there are 4 instances where the term Yireh Elohim is deployed almost in reference to non-Hebrews. One of them is in Abraham, when Abraham says, "For I said, surely there is no fear of God in this place, that they will kill me because of my wife, and they will kill me because of my wife." And that's when he goes down to, that's not the first time, it's the second time. That's because my spell check was off today. When he goes to Avimelech, and he's afraid, and he knows he's afraid that they have no fear of God there. So because there's no fear of God there, he said that he tells her to lie, basically. Okay, with regard to Joseph keeps the brothers incarcerated for 3 days, and Joseph, by the way, in this moment is pretending to be an Egyptian. So on the 3rd day of their incarceration, on the first time that the brothers went down, he said to them, "Do this and you shall live. Zot asu vichyu et ha'elohim ani yareh." I fear God. Okay, which is a Gentile, an imposter, saying, "I fear God." When we studied this a few weeks ago, I said it's very unusual. And it should have tipped off the brothers that this is very strange. But he is making reference to a moral principle that is beyond just the realm of his own context. Okay, and then the third case is in reference to Amalek, which comes later on in the Bible. When Amalek, when we are told to remember what Amalek did, the Torah uses the same term. Asher korcha baderech vayizanev becha kol hanechshanim acharecha v'ata ayef ve'agea v'lo yareh Elohim. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, V'lo yarei Elohim, undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. In other words, back to Leibowitz again, every single human being created in the image of God is obligated to fear God. Okay? And that's at the very, very,
What does
very...
that mean, to fear God?
To have a basic sense of morality, which includes not destroying the image of God. Okay? It's to have a basic morality that some things are wrong, and that there's no way of justifying a death, perpetrating a death, okay, except obviously in self-defense. All right, so that's what fear of God means, and these are four contexts: the Hebrew, I should say, the midwives, the Joseph, the Abraham, and the Amalek. Four places where fear of God is used as a justification for either behavior or a violation of the universal moral code. Okay. Now at this point, I want to turn to, or we'll do this. We'll finish the text here. Vayikra melech Mitzrayim lam he calls them in. He charges them. Why did you do this? Why did you do this thing? And you kept them alive. So they make up an excuse. The midwives say to Pharaoh, the women, the Hebrew women, are not like Egyptians. Now, how to translate that is a big question. Chayot, our translation says they're vigorous. Okay? B'terem tavo alehem hamyaledet v'yaladu. As soon as the midwife comes, they give birth. Okay, Ruth, you're shaking your head. You unmute. Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, it means they're animals. They're like animals.
Okay, so in some way, it's a very...
Also, they are full of life.
Beautiful.
מלאות חיים.
Yes.
Energetic, fast.
These are two clusters of interpretation. Both, I think, they work. The reason why they work is if you are trying to confirm the bias that Pharaoh has, that there's a swarm of Israelites. It connects back to Vayishritzu. So Chayot as animals is as preposterous as it is, and as pejorative as that term is, and derogatory. It feeds his own sense of, that's how I perceive them. They're just swarming. So Chayot, they are animals, and that's how animals give birth. But Alana, your answer is also plausible in the sense that this means that they are just full of life. They're full of life. They don't have difficulty in childbirth, which is contrary to the pre-Exodus traditions of all the women that are mentioned there, because Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, they all seem to have difficulty with children at some point, and Rachel even dies in childbirth. So it's unusual that it shows that the people have already transitioned in a different way, that the blessing which God has given them, that they will be a numerous nation, that the blessing is already starting to come out. So all of these ideas are compressed here into that text. Marlene, you have a question. Go ahead.
God promised that childbirth would be difficult with the Adam and Eve story.
In pain shall use give birth. According to Archie Bunker, in pain shall use.
Use?
בעצב תלדי בנים.
That's right. בעצב תלדי בנים. So God promises them a difficulty in childbirth, correct? But the lovely interpretation that is also that raising children is
It's the race.
also a very, very difficult prospect. It's full of anguish. It's not only about the physical act of childbirth, but it's like the act of raising children. And as we all know, the first 30 years are the hardest. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about the second 30
The
years?
second 30 years are hard too. Okay. All right. So and God, so they invent the excuse, and I think I would say that their excuse gives us another bit of evidence. And I have to say, if I were arguing the case in a real debate, I could be, every one of my points is totally debatable. I probably would not win in a court, okay? Because it's not hard evidence; it's interpreted evidence. I'm using the text and I'm saying, this leads me this way, this leads me this way, this leads me this way, etc. Okay, all right, and so God rewards them. Vayetev Elokim lamyaldot. God is good to them. Vayerev ha'am vayatzmu ba'od. So God is good to the midwives. The people become great. So this is not necessarily connected to one and the other. And then vayihi ki yaru amyaldot edalim, because they feared God. Vayas lahem batim. God made them batim. I don't know what that means. He made them households, whatever.
בתי מלוכה and בתי כהונה.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I'm now going to switch things. Okay, I don't. We don't. I know. I'm sorry. We don't have time to really discuss it, but I want to share with you another text. Okay, just before we get to that, I'm going to just do this, and I'm gonna. I know that some of you will understand this, but I couldn't resist doing this. I admire so much the teaching of Rabbi Beni Lau. I turn to him almost every week for Parsha lessons. It's in Hebrew. Okay, I'm gonna translate for you. Here we go. He says, "This is amazing." This is where I get a lot of "it's amazing." He says, I am a student of Nechama Leibowitz. He's 60-something years old, okay? And it's very interesting to talk about him for a while, but we don't have time. We had a class with her at her house. It was after the army for me. I went every Wednesday, every week. So he gives this class at 11 in the morning. He says, I'm going at 6 at night to her house every week. Okay, so he's talking to the moderator here, whose name is Liat Regev. She's an Israeli radio personality. And he says, we do this lesson on Wednesday. It already gets me into the mood of Shabbat. And I have to say, you know what? There's something to be said to that. If you study the Parsha on Wednesday, I mean, we're studying on Monday. I'm already in the mood for Shabbat on Monday. Okay. And it's only 2 days since last Shabbat. Okay.
זה משהו מדהים. בקיצור, נחמה ליבוביץ' העבירה את השיעור על זה, על המיילדות.
So Nechama Leibowitz gave this lesson on the midwives.
גם כותבת את זה בספר שלה.
And it's written in the book.
את הפירוש של רש"י הוא באמת מתוק.
And Rashi's commentary, who identifies the midwives, as Yolanda said, as Yocheved and Miriam, it's very matok. It's a very sweet commentary. And he's going to say, and you probably learned it in every single kindergarten in Israel. And the reason why it's very sweet is because it's in the family. It's all in the family, right? The midwives are in the family. So she's saying from the perspective of the Hebrew language, that the Hebrew language sovelet, and we'll get that translated in a second.
את המילת חסר שאומרת מיילדות את העבריות.
Okay, so the Hebrew language absorbs the word that is missing. It deletes a word which is et, the particle et. It should be hamyaldot et ha'ivriot. The text says mialdot ha'ivriot, the midwives, the Hebrews, and he's saying the Hebrew language deleted, because you can delete it from time to time, the word et. So it should say mialdot et ha'ivriot, the making the Hebrews the object of the midwives, okay?
את יודעת, בן גוריון מאוד מאוד הקפיד להוריד את מילת היחס את.
Ben Gurion himself wanted to eliminate the word et from the Hebrew language.
זה היה ממש חלק מהשפה המקראית.
He said it was a vestige of the biblical language, and he wanted to modernize and update the language.
לא לומר את המילה את.
Don't say et.
הטענה שטוען, הנה נורית נורא אוהבת את הפירוש שלך וגם אני.
So he's referring to someone on the text who wrote a comment that she likes to comment.
אז אומרת נחמה ליבוביץ' בשם כל מיני פרשנים, היא אספה מיוסף בן מתתיהו.
So Nechama Leibowitz collected a lot of commentaries, including Josephus, who mentions that in fact this term, mialdot ivriot, are Egyptian midwives.
יוסף פלביוס, דרך כל מיני פרשנויות אחרות, היא אספה שהמיילדות היו מתוך המיליה המצרי.
That the midwives were from the Egyptian milieu.
הם לא היו עבריות,
They were not Hebrews.
אלא הם היו מופקדות על מחלקת היולדות של העבריות.
So they were not Hebrews. They were dispatched on the department of obstetrics for the Hebrews. Okay, they were part of and he's really kind of influenced also by this idea that there are teams of them that are going out into the teams of Egyptians, and it kind of makes sense because midwifery was an Egyptian, as we saw with Herbert Rand, it was an Egyptian women's profession.
זאת אומרת, הפוזיציה שלהם הייתה מיילדות את העבריות.
So it means that their position was that they were the midwives to the Hebrews.
ואז הסיפור שהן הופכות להיות יראות אלוהים, וזה אולי החידוש הגדול של נחמה ליבוביץ'.
Okay, so now here we're getting to the whole essence of it. The idea that they were God-fearing, that's Nechama Leibovich's novel interpretation, that a Gentile could be God-fearing here. And it makes the story much more powerful. Okay, it's one thing if we understand them as, okay, it's, it's Rashi says it's Yocheved and Miriam, it's an inside, right? It doesn't make sense. It's a much more powerful story if they're outside. It affirms humanity. Listen to what he says now.
שהיא אומרת, יראת אלוהים שווה מוסר טבעי.
She's saying that the fear of God is a natural human value. It doesn't belong to Jews. It belongs to every human being. That's a remarkable insight into the text here. It's remarkable.
ככה, זאת הייתה הטענה. יראת אלוהים לא קשורה לאיזה סקטור. היא לא קשורה לזה שאתה יהודי או נוצרי או מוסלמי או אתאיסט. זה לא...
Okay, so being God-fearing is not tied to any sector. It doesn't matter if you're a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, or whatever. Okay, being God-fearing is a human thing.
לא קשור. יראת אלוהים זה המקום שאדם חי על פני האדמה, והוא אומר, אני לא אדון.
Being a God-fearing person is for someone to state that they live in the world and that they themselves are not the master of the world. Okay? Very, very important point.
אני לא אדון כל.
I'm not master of all.
אני לא משתלט על הכל.
I don't have power, control over everything.
המאבק הכי גדול במצרים,
He says the biggest conflict that existed in Egypt
זה מול התודעה הפרעונית.
is against the pharaonic idea, okay? That the conflict that exists for Israel and the conflict that exists for all human beings in Egypt is against the pharaonic ideal that is that the Pharaoh has control over everything, a totalitarian control
שאומרת אני אדון.
that says, I am the master.
אני חי באיזושהי מציאות של שררה ובית עבדים.
I live in a world that is controlled. I am living in a house of bondage.
שמעליי אין כלום.
And there's nothing above Pharaoh than Pharaoh.
אני השמיים ואני הארץ ואני מלוא כל הארץ.
I am the heaven, I am the earth, and I am the one that fills the whole earth.
כבודי. זה
With my glory.
הלוז של המצריות.
This is the calendar of the Egyptian.
ובתוך מצרים יש נשים שמיילדות ביראת אלוהים.
So he says, and here it's emotional, he says, can you imagine that within that structure, within that society, there are midwives who have a sense of something larger, and that's something much more powerful.
הן לא יראות את פרעה.
They're not fearful of Pharaoh,
ותראינה מיילדות את האלוהים, ולא עשו כאשר ציווה אותה מלך מצרים.
they fear God, and they don't do what the king of Egypt had asked them.
איזה דבר, אני חושב, שוב, אם יורשה לי ככה, גרמניה הנאצית.
Okay, so here he's going to make the step to the side, and this is going to be very, very important, and then we'll have some more to say about it. He says, permit me to make this analogy basically to Nazi Germany.
או כל מיני אזורים שההסכמה של השלטון
And many, many other places where the agreement to the element in power
זה לייצר רוח לא מוסרית.
is to create an immoral atmosphere, okay? That the population acquiesces to the figure in power in order to promote an immoral outcome.
ההסכמה הסביבתית נותנת פקודה בלתי חוקית בעליל.
Okay? This agreement gives, it's a hard one to translate. This agreement goes to illegality. I would repeat it, but it's not the most word.
אתה שואל את עצמך, האם יש בי עמוד שדרה
And so you have to ask yourself, do I have the spine
שנקרא יראת אלוהים?
that is called fear of God?
האם אני הייתי מסוגל לעמוד נגד הרוח?
Could I have stood up against that overwhelming spirit and atmosphere
ולמרוד בפרעה
and to rebel against Pharaoh
ולהגיד יש מעליי שמיים?
and to say that there's a heaven above me?
זה מבחן מדהים.
It's a huge, impossible almost test.
אני חושב שבאמת במבחן חסידות אומות העולם,
He says, I believe that the tension that the righteous among the world, righteous Gentiles, had to face was,
כאן זה מתחיל. הם בעיניי הראשונות.
he says, these are the first of the righteous Gentiles. It's a stunning kind of statement, and it makes total sense, because what they're doing is a moral rebellion, and they are creating in the moral rebellion a way that we gloss over these verses, pretty much. I mean, you read them in the space of 10 seconds practically, and what you have here is the essence of, first of all, it's a huge theme that within Egypt itself there are these personalities who object to the totalitarian power of the Egyptian Pharaoh and are willing to sacrifice themselves for it. They create an excuse. They say that, what do you want from us? We're told that they're in labor, and we show up and they've already had the baby, and they're off with the baby, right? They make up that excuse, and Pharaoh has no way of corroborating it. They get away with it. And not only do they get away with it, but they are rewarded for it. I think it's a stunning moment in this Parsha where we have a moral lesson that is not a particularly Jewish lesson. It's a universal moral lesson, okay? And he goes on here, and this is where it basically
האלה
says,
שרואות שמיים ולא יראות ממלך בשר ודם.
they see the heavens and they're not fearful of a human being. Okay, so that's where that ends. All right, so now I want to while we're doing that, first of all, let me stop here and get your comments on that. If anybody has any comments, first of all, he's really one of the finest public teachers in Israel today, and I know it's in Hebrew, but it's something to recommend. Okay, so we got Marlene, we got John. Go ahead, Marlene.
Are you inferring that there was no fear of anything other than Pharaoh? They embalmed their bodies, they put them in those crypts, and they expected some other world. So there must have been some other gods that they were. That's one. Number two, we get Moses's father-in-law who has a fear of God as a non-Jew, so that part of what he says I can accept, because there is a national or a universal sense of I'm not in charge.
Right. So there probably is a fear of a whole bunch of gods, okay? But Pharaoh is the embodiment of them. Pharaoh is the representative of them. And Pharaoh is the one to be feared with your life, because, Pharaoh has total power over you. So I mean, we are so, living in America, we take for granted our freedom. We take for granted that we are able to speak our minds, do what we want, live the way we want. It's not like that in a lot of the world. And you could, just go to China, go to Russia and speak your mind. Go, you can't do that. And we have forgotten what it means to live under the bruteness of a totalitarian power. Okay, go, John. And then Ilana, go ahead. You have the mute. You're still, I can't hear you. Press the space bar. No. There you go.
This universal theme is absolutely beautiful, and I wasn't aware of it before. And I think, tell me if this is correct, it's beautiful that the Torah endorses this universal message. When we think so much of the Torah as being representing tribal Judaism, that
Yes.
only Judaism has the key. And I think it's fantastic that here in the Torah, it seems that the biblical writer is endorsing this wonderful universal message.
Absolutely. I mean, this underscores the whole idea that if we could only teach the Bible in a way that took it outside of the realm of the criticism and the naivete and the charges of that it has been subjected to, and really allow it to be seen for what it is, I think we'd have a totally different appreciation of it. I think, I've said many times that the blame, for the sake of being brash here, we can blame a lot of people for that, including, scholarship of the Bible that makes the Bible so inaccessible to people that and not taken seriously. But there's also a strong anti-Semitic current to that as well. Ilana, go ahead. And Bob, I see you got lots of things. Okay.
So according to this theory, it's like, it's two theories, were they Hebrew or not Hebrew? Okay, so the reward, Vayas lahem batim,
Yeah.
is it literally he gave them beautiful houses, or is it according to the other way of explaining, if they were Hebrews, so from them came kings and ממלכת מלכים וכהנים.
Right.
So
So
is it, how's it going this way?
right. So the interpretation that he made them houses, and the tradition says, following the idea that they're Yocheved and Miriam, that they become the household of the Levites and the household of the Kohanim. I don't have an answer for it when it's Egyptians. If God is rewarding the Egyptians with batim, I don't know exactly what it means, other than to say, well, he made them, they were sustained. They had beautiful houses. I don't know if it means anything more, or I'm missing something, and for that we'd have to look a little more deeply.
Does Beni Lau explain something with this?
They go into it, and they go into it a little bit. Okay, there is she's actually much more interested. Liat is much more interested in than he is. But I'll send you the link. You'll take a look. Okay, so there's a whole article on this, but I wanna just I know we have no time left. I want to, for the sake of conclusion, I want to bring you this clip from Jordan Peterson, who talks about it. He talks about this very much, about what it takes to be a righteous among the Gentiles, and he says in his classes, he always asks people, what would you, if you were to imagine yourself living at that time, he says, when I ask my students who they identify with, they're more likely to say, we would have been the ones that would have rescued Anne Frank, right? And he says, listen to what he says.
And he does a very good job of documenting how an ordinary person transforms into a Nazi murderer. And I had to read that. I said, but don't you...
All right, let me set it up again. So he's talking about a client that he was treating for being so naive. And he instructed her to read the book Ordinary People, which describes how a garrison of Polish police officers were really transformed into an Einsatzgruppe. And they were a group of people who were ordinary, and they just were, they kept their jobs, and they shot Jews and murdered people. And it was the ordinary people that did that.
I said, this is about you, right? This isn't about someone else. When you read history, you think, well, that's about someone else. It's like, unless maybe you're a victim, you identify with the victims. It's a very rare person who reads history and identifies with the perpetrators.
That's his point. He says, we always like to think of ourselves as being, identifying with the victim, but the majority of people weren't victims. The majority of people were perpetrators.
But unless you read history and identify with the perpetrators, then you don't understand history at all. And so who wants to understand that? And I get my students, I said, look, I've told them this for 30 years. Here's something you have to understand. If you were in Nazi Germany, the statistical probability is overwhelming that you would have been a perpetrator. Right? You think you would have rescued Anne Frank. It's like, think again. Those people are very, 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 very rare. They put their lives on the line to do that. They put their families' lives on the line to do that. You think you're one of those people? Really? It's like that. All that means is that you know nothing. You know nothing about yourself. You know nothing about people. You know nothing about politics or economics or history. It's a harsh lesson.
But the truth about Germany in the 1930s, it was probably
okay. So there's that one
the
more
most
line.
educated society the world had seen to that point in time. Education alone, cleverness in inverted commas alone, intelligence alone,
Sophistication, civilization alone. No, right.
So
absolutely.
Okay, so we'll stop there, and that's his point. His point is that you think that you would have done that, right? But the statistical likelihood of you being righteous among the nations is minuscule compared to the likelihood of being a perpetrator. So he says part of what makes realism real is you have to be honest about it, and you have to be honest about yourself and who are you. And here, just back in the story, which is, again, it frames the story in such a more urgent manner, which is these people were acting against the grain. They were acting against the authority. They were acting against the totalitarian rule. They were acting against, everything that was conspiring against them. And yet, they still managed to save lives. That is something that needs to be noticed, and that is something that needs to be kind of magnified when you read this story. We don't pay close enough attention to it. And what has happened here is that because we have the traditional interpretation that they were Shifra and Pua were Yocheved and Miriam, we lose that message. There's an article, I don't have time to share it with you. It's from Torah.com. Let me just give you, I'll show you just where it is, 2 seconds here. This article here basically talks about this. And I'm going to scoot to the bottom, which is, why was the Egyptian forgotten? Okay, it was suppressed because the disappearance of the category of righteous Gentiles. The depiction of the midwives as righteous non-Israelite women reflected in Josephus, the Geniza. There's a whole tradition that they were not Israelites. Has to do because of the Babylonian Talmud's predominance. The Babylonian Talmud, had no place for liminal identities or blurring boundaries when it comes to fearing God. One is either Jew or Gentile, with conversion the only bridge between them. That's a fascinating point. In other words, it's a very binary way of looking at the world. People who fear God are Jews. People who don't, well, if they do, they convert. Okay. Later traditions move in one of two directions, but in each case making them unambiguously Jewish. It either casts the women as converts to Judaism, or conflates them with well-known Jewish figures, Miriam and Yocheved. And here again, it's a little, this is even more sharp. Another reason for the disappearance of the Egyptian midwife tradition from the classic Midrashic canon is because they are women. Okay, as the scholars have noted, Jewish texts, both Second Temple and Rabbinic, tend to associate women and non-Jews grouping together as other. This is a deep correlation cutting through many sources and is not necessarily reflective of a belief held by specific people. The Egyptian midwives tradition is a challenge to that correlation, undermining or subverting this common line of power, asserting that both non-Jews and women, in the case of non-Jewish women, in this case, non-Jewish can play a vital role in the salvation and even birth of the Jewish people from the slavery in Egypt. In other words, the tradition has a certain, develops a kind of a real strong immune response to Gentiles and also, I hate to say it, but women. It just, it obviously, submerges them and elevates the men, okay? So because these are women and they are not Jewish women, it's doubly. These life-giving Egyptian midwives stand in diametric opposition to the image of the seductive non-Jewish temptress, Shiksa, who threatens the identity of Jewish man. The Egyptian midwives do not conform to the system which contrasts male Israelite Jews with others, in which male Israelite Jews are always superior. These Egyptian women undermine the identity of this imagined male order and thus must be removed from it, okay? And finally, this to me makes more sense, which is the general mistrust of non-Jews, non-Jewish midwives, and that you still see manifestations of it today, in the most ugly ways sometimes, but it's still there. Mistrust of non-Jews, that the idea that Gentiles can be God-fearing and spiritual and holy is an anathema to certain sectors of the Jewish people. It still exists. Another reason for the fading of the Egyptian midwife tradition might stem from a deep suspicion of non-Jewish midwives as expressed in Tannaitic halakha. While Avodah Zarah permits the use of non-Jewish midwives, the parallel Tosefta permits them only under close watch. We don't have to read the text. The Tosefta cites the opinion of Rabbi Meir prohibiting the use of non-Jewish midwives because of an inherent mistrust towards a non-Jew that she will try to harm a Jewish child. While the sages permit their use, it is only where others are present to prevent any wrongdoing. The Babylonian Talmud adds a story where a non-Jewish midwife boasted of shedding the blood of Jewish women. This is in direct opposition to the Egyptian midwife tradition, in which non-Jews save the lives of Jewish babies and thus call into question the suspicious stance found in the Tannaitic law. Hence, it is clear that in certain rabbinic circles, there was a discomfort with the use of non-Jewish midwives, and that the image of non-Jewish midwife is that of a threat to the life of the Jewish infant. The ultimate canonization and great influence of this halakha is thus another reason for the fading of the Egyptian midwife tradition. Despite the greater authority of Mishnaic law, later Jewish law followed that Tosefta permitted a non-Jewish midwife only under Jewish. In other words, okay. So the question then is, why is it that we learn this text thinking of it as a text relating to Jews, Hebrew midwives? The reason is because the Masoretic tradition says Hamilyaldota Ivriot, okay? So it tilts us that way, but there's a strong tradition that tilts the other way. In my opinion, following Beni Lau, following Rashi, following Nechama Leibowitz, following what we were talking about, it's a much stronger story. It's a much more powerful story if they're Egyptian, because it just shows you that what is necessary in terms of being a moral, conscientious objector and the righteous among the nations. It's a much more penetrating story. Why that idea was submerged in Jewish tradition has to do with attitudes towards Gentiles and attitudes toward women that evolved over the centuries. And I think it's interesting that I can feel secure enough, teaching this text in our time to say, no, this is not what it's about. Of course, the Midrash has powerful, theological meaning, but it also makes a story much more powerful if they are from within Egyptian society. And more importantly, this is the biblical picture. The Bible's world it seems to be a much more, I don't want to say humane world, but it's a world that predates the oppression and the persecution and the death and the cruelty and the torment that was experienced already, during the rabbinic era and beyond. So we can forgive the Bible for being, we can forgive the later tradition for being hostile, and we can understand the biblical tradition because it predates a lot of the rest of Jewish history. I think this is just as Beni Lau would say, "Ze madhim, ze madhim, ze madhim." It's amazing. It's stunning. It's stunningly striking how this text can be taught now in our own context. Ze madhim. Okay. Anybody comment or we're good? Good. All right, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually a little different. Back to the beginning when you were talking about the word swarming.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that word is similar or different from the use of swarming on the fifth day of creation
Same word.
in Genesis. And is there any meaning to the fact of the creation of mankind and the creation of a people that comes out of this, with the midwives really shaping that whole process?
So also really important point. Yes, it's deliberate. I think the connection is well made. The fact that the women they structure it is a kind of, women in a certain mythology, and this is Jordan Peterson. Women are somewhat chaotic, and the fact that the women here represent the saving element, and many scholars point the fact out that women in the first chapters of Exodus play a huge role in sustaining the story. Look, you have the midwives, you have Miriam, you have Yocheved, you have the daughter of Pharaoh. All right, so you have 5 women, and then the 6th woman in this Parasha alone, Tzipporah. 6 women who are basically without which you don't have a story. So the story is really determined by women. It's absolutely fascinating. Yes, and it all connects back to the beginning too. Okay, John, you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one comment about the beginning, when there was talk about how the Egyptians were hostile to the Jews, Israelites multiplying. It reminds us of today, the way people, especially the white supremacists, speak about immigrants. And it seems like the Proud Boys who said the Jews will not replace us at Charlottesville were probably biblical scholars. They probably were reading Exodus and they knew where to get their information.
In the clip that I showed it from Beni Lau, he talks about that. It's another part of the parsha that what you have here, and this is true among all xenophobic despots, is that the fear of the other, that you will be replaced, and that of course is part of anti-Semitism. It's it's anti-Semitism that we see today, and anti-Semitism that is rooted all the way back there. I think I use this text also as a proto-anti-Semitic text because you have all the tropes, all the themes there. Ilana, you have a question?
I just wanted to, it's great to have these two theories. It all depends who you're teaching it to.
Sure.
If you're teaching it to younger children, you have to be maybe a little bit more traditional than this. But if you go higher by ages and levels, it's wonderful to present the other one.
I think so. I'm very inclined, and this is lately in my reading and my studying and my teaching, what I love often doing, it's a very easy way to teach the text, is to present the opposing views. It's a debate, and it's funny that the rabbinic debate is not between Jews and Gentiles. It's the rabbinic debate, the Talmudic debate is it Miriam and Yocheved, or is it Miriam and Elisheva? Elisheva is her daughter-in-law, right? And so that's the debate between Rav and Shmuel. They don't even mention the others, but I think it's really important to have this debate. Now the question really is, at what level do you engage the children in this debate? I suppose that will depend on the teacher, etc. And I would say, children can disagree with things at a very early age, and that's a way to engage them. I think that why it's so useful to present the Bible in a way that kind of raises a proposition and invites the debate is that it draws us in. We're invested in the outcome. As I think today's case really is a case in point. I think very much we are invested in the story because it shapes our understanding of the world. And as he said, who would have the spine to stand up? You would be in the minority of the minority of the minority if you were one of those people. And that's reality. That's the truth. It's a truth that many people don't face. They obviously identify with the Schindlers and the Sugiharas, and this is what we would do, and but they don't identify with the people who brought Anne Frank to the authorities, and those were the majority. There were people who had much more self-interest in staying alive and getting rewarded by doing that than the people who sacrificed their lives to hide them. And that's just the truth. Yeah. Okay, Marlene, go ahead. Last one.
And we call our daughters Shifra, but I don't know any Puas.
Yeah, well, that's because Pua.
It comes from Lifot,
Yeah.
the way young goats make the sound.
Yeah.
Poo, poo. And the way they spoke to the babies. Shifra made shoo, 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 and Pua made poo, poo, poo.
There you go. No, Shifra is related to the word shafir, which is beautiful. And
May Shafir is also the water that breaks when you starting to get to give birth.
Very nice, good.
Endless.
Pua is Egyptian for lass, a lass. Okay.
What is
Couldn't Shapir be Lishaper to improve?
Also the Shapir, right. The Shapir to make better. Lovely. All right, everyone. Such a great day. Have a great day. See you all in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks, okay?
Okay.
Talk to you.
Bye.